that's like the one at St. Rita that we did for the choir. Yeah, done about the same time. So. And I'll be talking about her tomorrow, because that's also this icon. This is just one element here of this whole icon. But unfortunately, you can't see much on that icon. The reason is the cover kept digging into the face of the icon because of all of the metal that comes in. Because they used to have halos outside of the head for the major characters here, and so the metal would go in and then go right into the surface of the icon. So I keep them separate.
Welcome to our evening lecture series of 2022 and our 49th year of our Catholic Institute. Tonight we have Father Jon Buffington speaking on Icons 101. Please welcome Father Jon.
I'm live? Yes, I'm live. Hello. You may remember when I started this morning, those of you who were here then, that I read a piece by a brother, John Samaha, who's a Society of Mary brother, from some lectures that he did, or some articles he did at the University of Dayton. Well, I'd like to read another small piece of him. When considering Mary, the mother of Christ, in Orthodoxy, one looks naturally and directly to the liturgical tradition. So in Orthodoxy, if you're going to look at Mary, you don't just stop with Scripture, because the praxis of the Church turned it into movement, into the life of the Church, which is liturgy. Liturgy not only includes prayers and hymns and antiphons and biblical readings of the Divine Liturgy and liturgies of all the feast days of the year, but also an iconographic tradition closely knit to the liturgical tradition. Icons are never separated truly from a liturgical meaning. You don't just write an icon because you happen to want to have something of somebody. And I've seen some very strange icons of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and others. They don't work as icons. You know, they don't quite fit the bill. The experience of knowing Mary is primarily realized in the chanted prayer of the liturgy and reverence for icons. Before we get into looking at Mary's icons, the first thing you need to know about icons is all icons are about the incarnation. It doesn't matter who is shown, it doesn't matter what the event is that's being displayed, they all take their beginning and their purpose and their final meaning from the incarnation of Christ. You will remember in the gospel, when Christ was heading on his way to Jerusalem, Philip came up to him and said, "Show us the Father and we'll be satisfied." And you can just see Jesus. "Philip, have you been with me all this time and you still don't know that to see me is to see the Father? He is the image of the Father. Therefore, to look on Christ is to look on God." And the word that Jesus uses is image, which in Greek is icon. That's the basic meaning of icon, image. It's an image of something, for something. It's never just of something, because you could have an image of the emperor, you could have an image of a king or a prince or a pretty woman or something, and it wouldn't be an icon. To be an icon, it needs to refer to Christ. Why? Before Christ, we were told not to make images. In Exodus, there's a prohibition against making images, which of course is then sort of fudged a little bit when they start talking about building the temple and all of the things that have to, well, not the temple yet, but the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of presence. There were many images in there, images of angels. You have the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. You have the cherubim sewn into the veil of the temple and so forth. So they were allowed to do some imaging. And in fact, if you go back to some of the old synagogues in the Roman Palestinian era, I'm not talking modern Palestine, the Roman Palestinian region covered all of those things that we think of as that Middle Eastern area, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, parts of Syria, and so forth. All of that was part of the Roman region of Palestine. Now, why did I do that? Oh, well, right. So, before that, it was very specific. Oh, I know where I was going. The synagogues. If you go to many of these synagogues, on the floors, there are elaborate mosaics, and they are figured mosaics. The most common one is to have a zodiac on the bottom, and there will be four female figures in the corners to represent the seasons. They didn't have any problem with doing that in their synagogue at a certain time. Now, there were other times when they became very iconoclastic and tried to destroy all of these, but they would ebb and flow. And there is a town that was originally a Greek town that was taken over by the Romans, Dura Europus, that has two of the most interesting early iconographic figures. There is a synagogue, and there is a Christian house church. It was at least used for baptisms, if not for Eucharist, but they are covered, both the synagogue and the house church, all the walls are covered in frescoes of events from the Old Testament and some events from the New Testament in the house church. But it is mainly the Old Testament that's being shown in both instances, even though Exodus exists. Jesus, being the image of the Father, of the same substance to the Father, is credited with writing the first icon. Now, I said writing because you don't paint an icon, technically, because all icons are the Word made flesh. What do you do with words? You don't paint words. You write words, you read words, you speak words. There's all kinds of things you can do with words, but painting is not first on the list. So we always say we write the icons because we're writing the Word. The first icon is supposed to be, oh, bless you. The first icon is supposed to be the Mandalion. And it was originally, according to legend, was supposed to have been made by Jesus himself. That there was a king in Edessa, which was in far Urfa. There are about 5 Edessas, so don't worry if you're confused about which one we're talking about. And just like there are 5 Antiochs, so you got to know what country is this particular Antioch in. Well, this king had leprosy, and he had a Jewish servant. Now, leprosy is not Hansen's disease. Leprosy was any kind of a skin condition that stayed. Could be eczema, could be leprosy, true Hansen's disease, or any other kind of disfiguring skin problem. But he had whatever it was a terrible case. But he had a Jewish servant who told him, you need to go and contact Jesus because he is a man of great power and great healing. So Abgar sent to Jesus a small delegation with his Jewish servant. He also sent the man who made his headdresses, who was an artist, and he was supposed to go, and Abgar wanted to have a picture of Jesus, so he was supposed to go and paint a painting of Jesus. They arrived, and Abgar sent Jesus this letter. I have a small kingdom, but it's big enough for both of us. If you can come and cure my leprosy, you can have half of it. Well, supposedly Jesus wrote the only letter he's ever ascribed to, other than writing in the sand when they come to stone the woman in the temple. And in this letter, he says, well, I'm a little busy now about my Father's work, but after I've gone back to him, I will send you someone who will cure your leprosy. Now, there's a couple different versions of this is the easy one. The guy who was supposed to paint the picture of Jesus tried and tried and tried, and he could not get the face of Jesus correctly. So finally, in frustration, Jesus just took the cloth from him, pressed it on his face, and handed it back to him with his face on it. That's why it's called mandalion, which is Greek for not made by hand. So it goes back, and there's an interesting thing that happens because of the histories. Abgar, when he sees this image coming toward him, he experiences a bright light coming out of it and the beginning of the healing from leprosy. His son, who was standing next to him, just saw brown smudges on cloth. This gives some evidence to those who like to think that the original mandalion was actually the Shroud of Turin, folded up so that only the face shows. And the earliest images we have of the mandalion have a crosshatch pattern on the background, and that crosshatch matches decoration on a statue that we have discovered of Abgar. So it's very likely, if that is true, it's possible that his headdress maker, who would have been the designer of the statue, also did this frame for the folded up shroud so that only the face could show. And it wasn't until centuries later that somebody took the frame off and found out there was a lot more cloth there than they thought, because it was eventually taken to the Blachernae Palace for their big relic collection in Constantinople. And all of a sudden, in about, I think, the 9th century or the 10th century, suddenly in their relic list is the burial cloth of Christ. And it's been remarked and remarked again and again, the different things they did to it. But so it's possible. It's only a possibility. But however it came about, this is considered the original icon, made by Jesus, given to someone for healing, which would fit directly into what Jesus did, whether it comes from the shroud or whether it comes from pressing his face to this cloth, which in the West, of course, became the Veronica's veil. So those tend to converge. Now, we look at Mary. Why do we look at Mary? She is Theotokos. First and foremost, as Jon Samaha said, that is the main reason we honor Mary, because she was the God-bearer. And all that surrounded her becoming the God-bearer, her Immaculate Conception, her freedom, her constant virginity, and so forth. All of that has to do with her being Theotokos, being the mother of God, the God-bearer. She always points toward her son. One of the icons that is most famous and most beloved in the Orthodox tradition is what is called the Hodegetria. We just happen to have one. And if you take a good look at it, you'll see Mary with Jesus sitting on her hand, and with her left hand, she's pointing toward him. She who shows the way, Hodegetria, that's what it means. So she is pointing toward her son, but she doesn't look at him. She looks out here with a very sad, wistful expression on her face. She knows what is coming. Sure, she's happy she has a child, but she knows that he is destined for death, sacrifice. Jesus will very often look at Mary in icons, but just as likely he'll be also looking out at you, because when he's blessing, he doesn't bless Mary, he blesses all of us who are outside the icon being invited in. So when Mary looks out, she's looking for people like you to join her. Now this is kind of an interesting icon that I'll be talking about again the day after tomorrow, because you'll also, if you look at it, you'll also notice there's an extra hand down here in silver. It's hanging around her neck. There are many icons of this particular icon called the Three-Handed Madonna, one of which, if you get a chance, come over and look at this one, where the third hand is just popping up from the bottom. And there are many icons where the hand, there are like two hands coming up this way, there's one coming straight up, there's one coming down. It can show up anywhere because they forgot the reason it's there. And the reason it's there is that John of Damascus, in Thanksgiving, for a miracle that I'll explain later, had a silver copy of his handmaid, because she cured his hand, and hung it around his favorite icon, the Hodegetria. People forgot where that came from, so they saw the third hand, and they weren't sure why it was there, but it was there, so let's keep it. So they just kept posting it in all kinds of different places. So if you ever see a weird icon of Mary with three hands, you'll know where it comes from. Now, as Theotokos, and she is in liturgy as one of the central characters for the liturgy. Of course, Christ, God the Father, to whom the liturgy is addressed, is central, but the liturgy is about the Christ and the sacrifice of the Christ. But it's also very much a liturgy involving Mary. Whenever there is a major feast in Orthodoxy, the next day is usually the synaxis of that feast, which is a word, again, meaning the pulling out or the commenting on the feast. Now, we've started doing that in the Western tradition in order to join the Orthodox. For instance, we now have, instead of the Feast of the Circumcision on January 1st, what do we have? Mary, Mother of God. That comes because the Orthodox, the day after the Nativity, which is for them January 6th, although in this country they do use the 25th of December, they have the synaxis of the motherhood of Mary. And that's why we changed the name from circumcision to Mother of God, in case you ever wondered about that. A lot of people think that we were just squeamish at the idea of taking a knife to Jesus. But no, it's in order for us to join our brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ. Within the liturgy, the esteem of Mary is always shown up. Now, I want to read from you a hymn, prayer, that is always said in the Byzantine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, right after, immediately after the consecration of the elements of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. This is sung recognizing Mary's role in the Eucharist. It is truly right to bless you, Theotokos, ever blessed, most pure, and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim. Without corruption you gave birth to God the Word. We magnify you, the true Theotokos. That's in the liturgy right after the consecration. We have nothing like it in the Latin tradition, but it is common to always, when you get to one of those major events in liturgy, to then turn to Mary, because it comes to us through her bearing of the Christ. Now, there are two well-known feasts in the Orthodox tradition that are connected to miraculous icons. One comes from the early ecumenical discussions of Mary as mediatrix. And they represent spiritual gifts coming to the faithful through the Theotokos, demonstrating their tradition that supplication to the Virgin is something that happened long before the divisions of our churches. So it was a common thing for us to go to Mary in the early church from the 4th century on, 400s on. And there, from that came an icon called the Theotokos of the life-giving fountain. It's a common and important icon of which, unfortunately, I have no representation. But what it is Mary is holding the child, and there are a couple different ways she can hold the child, and she, from the waist down, she is in a fountain. But coming from the fountain are many streams of water to water the world with grace. And it is Mary, the ever life-giving fountain. It recalls that in the 4th century, around Constantinople, there was a young man named Leo who would eventually become the emperor in Byzantium. And he was out for a daily walk, and he heard the cries of a blind man who was dying of thirst, crying out for water. Now, at first, not finding any water to help the blind man, Leo, the young man, was going to go and try to find some water, go back to the city and try to find some water. But then he heard a voice of a woman. And the woman called him over to a place where he would find water. And this place became a place of great healing. And the voice, according to the tradition, was that of Mary, the Theotokos, giving life-giving water from her son. Remember, it's not just Mary in that fountain, it's Mary with her son. So through Mary, Christ brings forth his blessings. Or that she who metaphorically is called the source of the source, so she's the source of the grace coming from Jesus, that she who is the source of Christ's healing, as represented by the water, became an important feast, and today is celebrated on the Friday after the Great Pascha, the Easter feast. And now Friday after Easter, in what's called Bright Week, we call it Easter Week. They call it Bright Week. It's an incredibly joyful celebration of Christ providing life and sustenance, physically and spiritually, to everybody, to all the faithful, and through his mother. Now, the fountain shrine is still present today. It's just outside modern Istanbul, after having been built, then destroyed, and then restored many times through the centuries. But they kept rebuilding because this was so important to their spirituality, this particular place of solace and healing. Like all other Marian feasts, it signifies a great theological truth. In this case, how Christ is the well of life and his mother is but the fountain. That which flows forth for healing is the Christ. Where it flows from is the womb of the Virgin. Now, there's another one that I do happen to have evidence of here, and it is called the Theotokos of Blachernae, or the Virgin of Protection, or the Lady of the Veil. So you can pick any of those titles and you'll get the same icon. Lady of Protection, or the Virgin of Protection, Theotokos of Protection, is the most common way we think of it. And those of you who have been to St. Rita's, you've seen this icon before. This is the Madonna from the top center of the icon, where she is seen holding out her veil over the people of Istanbul, Constantinople at that time, protecting them from the Tartars and the other people that were coming. There was a story that, I'm trying to think of who it was. She appeared sometime, and it's vague here, sometime between the 5th and the 10th century. She appeared on the bema of the cathedral. And the Blachernae is the church inside the imperial palace in Istanbul, in Constantinople. So it was the imperial church. She appeared on the bema, and the bema is where the altar and where the scriptures were read. So she appeared there, and this was in a particular part of the church dedicated to a relic that is supposed to have been there, which was the belt of the Madonna. It's what she is supposed to have given to St. Thomas when he again was late for her Assumption. Poor Thomas. But it's supposed to have ended up in Constantinople because they were collecting relics from everywhere. She is seen, now I'll have to show you two copies at the same time. This is called a Riza, and it is made as a cover to honor an icon. This icon, as you can tell, is in terrible shape, and it is only a drawing, basically, with just the faces and the hands painted in, because those are the only parts that you're going to see through this. So when they made this icon, they knew it was going to be covered by this. This is handmade, a very skilled but naive artist. And this was done also by a naive artist. They just sketched in all of the bodies and put in all of the things that had to be there, like the inscriptions, the shine. Up here, Christ is appearing. So you've got Jesus Christos, and on the other side of Mary, you have her name, Miriam Theotokos. Then down here, you have the rest of the story of this thing, plus how it rolled out through history. Because after Mary appears above the bema, and they started making these images of her, they began adding people to the story. Down here at the bottom, right in the middle, is a deacon. And this is a man who was a great writer of hymns and poems, probably the greatest after Ephraim the Syrian, by the name of Romanus the Melodiist, or the hymn writer. And he was dedicated to this Madonna, and then he was given a vision of it. In the other corner of this same story, there is a guy in just rags, looking sort of like John the Baptist on a bad day. And he has a young man next to him, and he's pointing up at the Madonna. He is what was called a fool for Christ, someone who just gave up the world completely, lived in rags, if they lived in anything at all. Very often they went around naked, winter and summer, and pointed out the Madonna appearing to the people, and he's the one who then went to tell the emperor, the young boy. So it can be a very complicated icon. There are also various on the sides. These figures here are hierarchs that weren't there at the time, but they are bishops and saints that were very much devoted to Mary, and then were added to this icon as part of what she was protecting. Romanus the Melodist. And then later, and related to the Virgin of Protection, there is an icon of Mary with her open cloak and the child on her breast. I referred to it earlier. It's called Our Lady of the Sign, earlier this morning. And it's a very common icon and a very beloved icon. And it is a picture of the pregnant Madonna, even though there's the child there. In reality, it is a picture of her in her pregnancy with the child in her womb, even though he's standing there blessing you, because he is bringing his blessings into the world. She is in an Oran's position, and lifting us all up to heaven. So these icons began to create other icons in the same language to try to bring us all to the realization that Christ was truly man and truly God, because he was born physically of a woman into our world, so that he comes to us through the Theotokos, even though she kept her virginity before, during, and after. That's what the 3 stars on her icons are all about. She was a virgin before the birth, she was a virgin during the birth, she was a virgin after the birth. And that's what the story I told you earlier about the midwife who checked her virginity and therefore her hand caught on fire. Because it was very important for them at that time to honor the virginity of Mary. Remember, by this point, most of the martyrdoms were over, at least the general martyrdoms. The Persians were beginning to attack Christians because they thought they were spies for the Romans at this point. But in the Roman territories, in the Byzantine territories, virginity and eremitism, becoming a monk out in the desert, were the new martyrs. So that virginity of Mary was the ultimate martyrdom, witness. Martyrdom means witness, remember that. So by this point, it's a bloodless witness to the coming of Christ into the world. By the way, that... oh, okay. I thought I did it. That's called the Platitera icon. This one, the sign. There is also a service sung during that 2-week Lenten period before. They have lots of Lents, by the way, in the Orthodox tradition. The 2-week Lenten period before the Feast of the Dormition. The Feast of the Dormition is the Feast of the Falling Asleep. That's what Dormition means, or the death of Mary. And during that, there is a hymn that is very popular and obviously demonstrates that from ancient times, Mary, the mother, is considered the mediator of love and care of her son, mediator from her son. The concluding verse of the small paraklesis is what the service is called, the small paraklesis, in itself demonstrates the importance of her mediation as well as the humility of her motherhood. And here is the hymn. This is the end of the hymn. I have you as mediator before God who loves humanity. May he not question my action before the hosts of the angels. I ask of you, O Virgin, hasten now quickly to my aid. You are a tower adorned with gold, a city surrounded by 12 walls, a shining throne touched by the sun, a royal seat for the king. O unexplainable wonder, how do you nurse the Master? Think about what that's saying to you. I have you as mediator, bold and black, before God who loves humankind. So she stands before God imploring for us. And he asks that the Madonna have God not question my life, not question my actions before the hosts of heaven. So when I come to judgment, be there to speak for me. You know, there's that wonderful story of Christ going around heaven and seeing all these people there that he thought he had sent to other places and wondering how they got in there. And so he told Peter, all right, I want you to double the guard. And he comes out the next week and there's even more people. And he goes to Peter and says, all right, what's happening? And Peter looks at him and says, your mother. She opened a gate. So that's, in a joke, what's happening here in liturgy. That they are looking to Mary to find kindness for them in the face of God's mercy, because they're afraid of God's justice. You're a tower adorned with gold. That's an Old Testament image. If you go into the cathedral here in Portland and take a look above if you're looking at the Madonna on the left-hand side, there are those angels up at the top. One set of angels are singing their lungs out, but the inner two sections of angels, they're all holding objects. And except for one case, they are all figures from the Old Testament that were then brought into the New Testament tradition as types of Mary. the Tower of Ivory, the Ark of the Covenant, the mirror of the sun, and so forth. And some of those are used in these hymns. Tower of Ivory, because of being a virgin. The Rose of Sharon, the most beloved of all the flowers in the Mideast, and so forth. The only thing that isn't scriptural is one of the angels is holding a rosary. So if you look for the one that's doing this, that's a rosary. Okay. Now there are quite a number of wonderful old hymns, but we're going to do hymns tomorrow in the first lecture, or in my lecture tomorrow. But I wanted to explain and to unroll some of these icons so that you can begin to learn how to read them when you go to an icon. Well, I could drive you crazy with this one. This is called the Lady of the Burning Bush, and it's perhaps, if not it is close to being the most complicated icon known. The Madonna and Child are in the center, but there's no burning bush around her. But in her lap, there is a ladder, and there is a mountain, and a couple other, in different icons, there are a couple other things there. The ladder is Jacob's ladder. And what did Jacob use the ladder for? The angels going from earth to heaven. For Mary, it's for her to help us go from earth to heaven. The mountain is the mountain of Sinai, where the burning bush was. So she is that mountain upon which God showed himself to people. Now, around the corners of this, well, first there's God the Father up here, which means it has to be after the 1500s, because you weren't allowed to show God the Father in physical form. Most you would have is a hand or something else to indicate that the Father is there. He was never represented in early iconography as in a human form. But around in the corners are 4 times that are considered types of Mary. Am I running over? No, good. Types of Mary. So you have the burning bush over here. Oh, no, here's the burning bush with Moses in front of it. They use this as a type of Mary because the bush was burning but not consumed. Mary was a mother but didn't lose her virginity. Out of the burning bush comes a voice, and it was, at least in the Orthodox tradition, it was always considered that it was the Word that spoke to Jesus. And it was the Word that spoke from Mount Sinai. It was the Word that encountered the various prophets and so forth. And here you have Jacob having his vision. Down here you've got Isaiah having a vision of the temple with the temple doors opening and this one like the Son of Man coming out. So again, a Jesus figure. And here's Jacob with his ladder with the angels heading up. Then you have this 8-pointed star made out of the blue star and the red star. And inside the red, are the 4 evangelists. So you've got the ox, the lion, the eagle, and the man. In the blue, you have angels that have the elements in their hands. So you've got a rainbow for water, and you've got clouds, and you've got dirt, and so forth. Then outside here are angels that nobody ever seems to figure out what they're doing. Some of them can be figured, like this guy has his hands full of clouds, this one has something else. But it's a terribly complicated icon. But if you're going to look at it, the first thing you want to do is go to the center of the icon. This is the most important part, the Madonna and Child. And then everything radiates out of that to explain this Madonna. So the next time you go into the gorge and you go up to Sam Hill's place, take a look at some of their icons up there. For instance, this one, this is a Greek icon of St. George. Now, it's pretty easy to see that this icon refers back to Christ. How does this icon refer back to Christ? The one thing icons do is they don't live in this realm. There's nothing three-dimensional about them. There's a little bit of shading, but you're not going to see this guy walking down the street. The garments that he's wearing are garments that never would have been worn by a Roman soldier. In an icon, there's no source of light exterior coming down. If this were a portrait, there would be, one side would be brighter than the other. The shadows would be very different and so forth. But from this, in an icon, light comes from inside. So that the point of light is the Christ that shines forth from the icon. And that's why they use so much gold, because gold was to represent the divine sphere. So when you see this surround of gold and all the detailing in his halo and the gold on his garment, that's to indicate the life of Christ in him, surrounding him, suffusing him. And through him, looking at you, telling you, this also you may have if you come with me and follow to Christ. I do like George. He's fun. Whoops. Now you choose an icon. Which one would you like to have explained? Oh, here's a good one. All right. Now, I said that was the most complicated icon because of how detailed it is. This one is just complicated because of the story. I mean, it's a Russian icon. Some friends from the hospital went back to Russia and they would bring back these icons. And I saw this and I thought, I have never seen an icon that looks anything like this. Again, go to the center. That's the most important part, which has the crucifixion. But this crucifixion is a little different. He's bleeding from his hands and feet. Normally you don't have that in an Eastern icon. It might be a little bit of blood, like you have on the icon of St. Francis over here, San Damiano. But what's happening with him is the blood is then going to come down to the bottom of the icon there and splash on the head of the bones down there. And those are the bones of Adam. That's why in a lot of your crucifixes, you see a skull and crossbones on the bottom. It's not because he was on Calvary, the place of the skull, but because Calvary was over the tomb of Adam. That's why it's called the place of the skull. Now, up here, you've already got Jesus dying down here. He's never really dead on an Orthodox cross. But up here, you've got Jesus quite alive and happy, looking down from heaven. And you can tell it's Jesus because he has the cruciform halo, and inside the halo is written, I am. The answer that when Moses went to God and said, all right, who shall I say is sending me? Tell them I am sent you. So they are the three Greek letters for the words I am. And they'll always be in the halo of the Christ. Well, not always, but usually in the halo of Christ. But he's the only one that will have a cruciform halo. In the West, and the Orthodox consider this rank heresy, we very often put a cruciform halo on the Holy Spirit. And they would consider that heretical because it then means that the Holy Spirit was crucified. And that's not allowed. The only one who was crucified was the Son. Now, here you have two Madonnas. On this side, you have her touching her cheek. You have her touching her cheek to the child. And that's what it's called Eloisia, the Theotokos of tenderness. And and she's holding his hand, so it's a very intimate icon. It's very unusual. But even then, she's not looking at him. She's looking at you. The other Madonna and child over here is this one. But there's one hand holding up the child. There's the other hand pointing at the child. And then there's his hand just sticking up from the bottom. So again, it's the three-handed Madonna of Jon John Damascus. Now, on either side of the crucifix, on this long black cross, you have two Marys, and both are identified as Mary, but this one is Miriam Theotokos. This one is Mary Magdalene. So they're at the crucifixion, so obviously this is following John. Down at the bottom, and these must have been just favorite saints and favorite icons of whoever commissioned this icon. It's the only way I can come to understanding why all this stuff is together, is this is St. George again, killing the dragon, and George is always on a white horse. Demetrius is usually on a blue or a black horse, and he's usually killing a Moor. But in this case, this is George killing the dragon. And over here is another figure on a winged horse, and that's St. Michael trumpeting the final judgment. So he's on this weird horse, and then there's angels up here grabbing from him his sword to start the end of days. How's that for complicated? I do like that one. Now, you won't be able to see this one very well, but this is called the Theotokos, Joy of All the Sorrowing. And there's a wonderful story that goes with it. The icon itself is that of the Madonna. She's holding her one hand out and one hand holding a scepter. And there are all these people around the bottom interceding to her for their pain and their sorrows. And it was a very popular icon in Russia. But one day, the little wooden church that the icon resided in caught fire. And the icon was blown over on top of a bed of offerings given for the icon. So there were a lot of coins in there, and the fire was so hot, it melted many of the coins, which then stuck to the face of the otherwise totally undamaged icon. The rest of the church was gone, but the icon with those coins stuck to her is still in existence today. And so that's why when you come up, you can see all these little balloons that are all over there. Those are to represent the coins that melted into the surface of this icon. But again, and there are angel helpers here, they are listening to the Madonna petition for the needs of the people. And who does she petition to? So again, it refers back to Jesus. By herself, Mary has no power. But by involving herself in the incarnation, by participating in the coming of the Son of God, she refers and is the Theotokos who refers and bears us and takes us to her Son. Now you've already done this one. This other one is just basically a St. Nicholas. But there's an interesting story about Nicholas. Now, we all think of him in the Santa Claus mode, right? Patron of children and so forth. And there's a lot of reasons. There's a million stories about St. Nicholas. Usually this icon would have if it were bigger, it would have circles or appearances on one side of Christ holding a book of Gospels, and on the other side, the Madonna holding a liturgical vestment out to St. Nicholas. And the idea is, according to history, at the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas was one of the bishops who was present. He was the bishop of Smyrna, which is on the coast of what is now Turkey. And when Arius came and started telling people what he thought of the Christ, how he wasn't God the way God the Father was God, but was made divine by a special creation, Nicholas was so outraged that he got up and knocked him down, just belted him one, and he went down. And the other bishops were so horrified that a bishop would react in such a terrible way that they stripped him of his vestments, they degraded him from being a bishop, and threw him into prison. Well, that night, Mary and Christ appeared to him, Christ handing him back the book of Gospels, which meant giving him back the ability to preach, and Mary gave him back the garments that they had stripped from him. So in the morning, when they came to let him out of the prison and they saw him dressed, ready for liturgy, they knew they had made the mistake, not Nicholas. So when you're looking at icons of St. Nicholas, see if you can find ones that have the Madonna and the Madonna on this side and Christ on the right-hand side, because that's what that story is. And you'll find a lot of Nicholases and other saints, St. George and many others, with around the frame you'll have a large area where you have the stories of the saints. If they were martyred, you'll have all the stories of their passion. If they were bishops like Nicholas, you'll have stories around them of saving the 3 children. Supposedly there was a famine. And there was one butcher who always seemed to have meat. And Nicholas was a little worried about this, so he went down to the man's cellars, and there was a big cask down there, and he had him open up the cask, and out jumped 3 children who had been killed and were being pickled because that's what he was serving to the people who came. And that's how Nicholas becomes the patron saint of children, because he saved the lives of these children from this guy. Wasn't that fun? Also, St. Nicholas is the patron saint of pawnbrokers. Want to know how that happened? Well, before Nicholas became a cleric, he was the son of a very wealthy family, and his father and mother both died, so he inherited quite a lot of money and didn't know, quite what to do with it, because he knew he was heading toward the church. And he heard about a man in the town he was living in who had 3 daughters, but the man had become impoverished, and he had no money to be able to pay a dowry for his daughters to get married. So he was going to sell his oldest daughter into prostitution, just so that they could survive. Well, Nicholas heard about this, so the night before this was all supposed to happen, he came and threw in a bag of gold. Some people say it was a little round thing of gold, but a bag of gold in the window, and then just left before they could find out who did it. And in the morning, the man woke up and saw it, and he was so startled he had no idea where it came from, but he knew exactly what to do with it. He was able to marry off his first daughter in style, and she was able to live happily. Time came for the second daughter. Well, the money was gone. So Nicholas heard about that, and he came again, threw in another bag. That daughter got married off. Third daughter's marriage was coming up. The guy was determined to find out what had happened, who was doing this kindness for him. So he stayed up all night, peering out the window, and caught Nicholas. And Nicholas made him promise that he would not reveal to anybody until he died who had done the kindness to him. So these are wonderful stories about Nicholas that you can find surrounding his icons, or even just icons by themselves. I have an icon that I did of Nicholas where he's a patron. He's also a patron of sailors, mainly because according to one story, there was a boat trying to get to safe harbor during a storm. The waves were crashing, and the men looked up and they saw that their rigging was being fouled by demons. One of the sailors cried out to Nicholas. Now, Nicholas was long dead by this point. And Nicholas appears to them, chases off the demons, and pulls one sailor who had fallen into the water back into the boat, and then safely gets the boat to harbor. And that's why he becomes patron saint of sailors. So he's patron saint of an awful lot of things in quite a lot of countries, Russia, Greece, and so forth. Now, where am I going with all of this? We've already done the small paraclesis. We'll wait for this for tomorrow. Any rate, there's another thing about icons that you should look for, and that is to tell whether it's a very old icon or a very new icon. And the way you do that is by looking at the blessing hand of Christ. because his hand should spell out Jesus. Now, if you can figure that out, but that spells out Jesus in Greek. There was before the Patriarch Nikon in Istanbul, in Russia, there was a different form of blessing that the Christ used to use, and he would have both hands out doing something like this. That is still used by the Old Believers. And we have a large community of Old Believer Russians in this area. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But if you go up to Mount Angel and you go behind the place where the bells are outside and where the new dormitory is and down the hill, there is a small Russian church down there that one of the brothers built for the Old Believers in that area. Now, when they broke off from the Russian church because they would not accept these, it was sort of like not accepting Vatican II. They didn't accept these reforms in liturgy, in iconography, in how the church itself was working. They refused to accept that, and they broke away from the Russian church. But only a few priests went with them. They had no bishops to be able to consecrate new priests or new bishops. So they became a church with liturgy, without clergy. And so when you go into an old Russian community and go into the church, it'll look like a regular Russian church. But if you pay attention, you notice there's some very, I don't want to say small differences, but there are some very real differences in how they do their liturgy. Now there's a movement for some bishops to come in and begin to create priests for them. It's a question as to whether they're going to accept that or not, but we don't know. Anyway, so how are we doing on icons? By the way, here is another version. This is what I had up for it. This is what the Blachernae would look like. Partially look like in color. So instead of the one that I picked up before, here's the lady. But notice that she doesn't have in this one, she's not holding the veil. And that is occasionally allowed, but the true Madonna of protection would have the veil. Now in the West, we have something else, which is a Madonna. If you've seen the Madonna of the immigrants and the Madonna of protection of those in trouble, she has her cape out, and then there's crowds of people in the cape. Same idea as the Madonna of protection, and that's where that icon comes from. Okay, well, it's about time for us to break. It's 5 minutes early. I think we can do that, unless you have, and then we're going to do question and answers and everything else afterwards, okay? So go off, my children, get hydrated, and bring back questions.